micro-fulfillment can be done on a manual basis, but typically when people talk about micro-fulfillment, they're talking about an automated system. And then you advance that to dark store, which may actually be a store which has been evacuated and converted into effectively a larger micro-fulfillment center, or it could be a purpose-built building, and it supports a small number of stores, maybe 3 or 4 local stores. And again, it supports click and collect from that location, as well as click and collect from the stores, being picked in that environment and being shipped to the stores, or home delivery straight from that dark store, so it doesn't affect the store operation at all. And it can also be used to replenish store shelves. So the challenges with digital fulfillment, and this is a huge elephant in the room, that people have got onto the bandwagon that somehow e-commerce is going to save retail and it's going to make so much money, and it's 40%, and this pandemic has given us a golden opportunity. But often the financial models that have been built to say, yes, this is a good idea, let's go forward with it, they can be fraught with errors. They can be on a basis that they may not have done e-commerce before. There'd be a number of costs that suddenly come into their appreciation after they launch into it. So they may think, right, on the basis of this volume that we hope to achieve, yeah, we're going to go forward with e-commerce. We're going to offer our proposition online.
Welcome and thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm a senior executive on call, helping organisations in the make, move, sell flow of consumer goods and services. My purpose is to inspire business leaders to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available through my website, RetailAID.ca, and on my YouTube channel, RetailAID, all one string. Be sure to check it out. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started.
Okay, so Mark, I'll hand this back to you for the session objectives and the introductions.
All righty. So today, the session objectives, the next 2 hours are going to be awesome, talking about supply chain. So it's really, starting out with what is supply chain management, and then Gary's going to take us through what are the key factors that underpin the performance of supply chain. I'm sure I'm going to learn a ton today too, because this is one area of retail I really haven't spent a lot of time in. So, and Gary's going to take us an overview of supply chain design, something he's done many times throughout his career. And then the challenges facing retailers with store order fulfillment. So there's obviously a ton of changes going on, and the pandemic has really brought on even more changes with blurring the lines of what's online and what's in store and combining the two. So obviously it's put a lot of pressure on supply chain. So, one of them is the challenges with the store order fulfillment. The other one's the digital fulfillment. And then how can supply chain management relate to category management? And Gary's going to touch on that as well. So Gary, it's a privilege to have us with you today. And I know that we have a lot of really keen students in the class that have been fantastically engaged over the first 3 sessions. And I know that they're going to learn a lot from you, and they'll have a lot of questions for you along the way too. So welcome aboard, and look forward to you taking us through your material in the next couple hours.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Mark. And it's a great honor to be here to share some of the knowledge I've built up over a long period of time. I'm going to share my screen.
Sure.
If that's all right. I hope I'm sharing the right screen here. I've been involved with supply chain over a fairly long period of time, particularly in the retail end-to-end retail supply chain. So I've been working with manufacturers, wholesalers, third-party logistics, retail, and the last mile. And I've brought about innovation,
digitization and agility across the retail supply chain. And particularly I've done a lot of business turnarounds and strategic transformations. So that's just a little sort of thumbnail sketch of where I'm coming from. I'm going to invite you, if you've got any questions, just chip in. Each of my slides is going to basically have a question at the end of it, and I'm going to put it back to you. If you want to contribute to the conversation, please do. If not, if I've been incredibly clear in what I've said, then no problems. I'll move on. I'm going to talk about supply chain management. What is it? What's broadly in the scope? And I'm going to be using it depends quite often through this presentation, because every retailer, there's not an average retailer. I'd love there to be an average retailer and to say this is how every retailer as a result of that average retailer should behave. What I hope to give you is some perspective of what I've seen over time, and also perhaps a model towards where we all as retailers might want to migrate towards. I want to talk about the elements in the supply chain, what other terms can be used for the supply chain, how the supply chain can be sometimes misrepresented, misdescribed. How does it fit within a competitive framework? And what are the key priorities, therefore, for what a retail supply chain needs to do? So if I can just step back, what is it? Because, and I have to then say quite quickly, it depends. But I would like to say that if I put all our four major grocers in a room and said, describe a supply chain, they would all describe it just slightly differently about what's in it, what's in the scope of it, how is it managed, how is it organized. So sometimes it's worth just stepping back from the detail of how each retailer chooses to set it up, because sometimes it's a matter of history, sometimes it's actually by design. But I put this supply chain in this kind of languaging. So typically we think about things around the warehouse, the transportation, the inventory, activities to generate inventory to come into our warehouse. Sometimes the activities are in the office, sometimes they're operational in the warehouse, in transport yard, on trucks. I like to think of all these activities within our four walls as activities, and I would put a label before it called it logistics activities, and that goes all the way through to the store, including in-store. And I might be somewhat of a heretic here, because when we take stuff off the vehicle and we make it ready to go onto the shelves, that's all still part of a logistics activity, receiving, checking, making ready for shelf display or putting out an in-cap display unit. I would argue that's all part of a supply chain. It doesn't get to be on the shelf unless the supply chain's kind of all over it. So if we think about all those logistics activities as almost independent variables in the overall picture of things, supply chain management is orchestrating all these logistics activities that deliver value to the consumer or the end consumer. So if that arrangement of logistics activities adds no value to the consumer, the chances are the consumer won't want to indulge in buying it. So the supply chain would be, I would classify that as either badly designed or just a major failure. So that's a broad scope, but we often find when we're looking at a supply chain within an individual retailer, some of those activities might be in store replan, they might be in merchandising. Clearly, the back end of the supply chain, the store side, is in stores. Way that information is collected and reported, it can seem to be a very fragmented, silo-driven kind of operation. And the ideal supply chain should be horizontal. It goes across the whole business. If you're in the grocery space, you talk about the farm to fork as the overall supply chain. And the supply chain tends to be some of the more cerebral activities around that, purchase ordering, planning, forecasting, as well as the physicality of moving it from the farm to the processing unit, into maybe a supplier or a wholesaler, into a retailer, into the store. So what other terms can be used for the supply chain? We sometimes have a VP of logistics, and they might have quite a wide scope, which includes some of those things I talked about. Sometimes it can be just the physical logistics, it can be the warehouse or warehouse network if you've got more than one warehouse, and the transportation operation. but we can sometimes call it the value chain. You may have heard of the value chain. And this is really sort of plays off this idea that logistics components can be coordinated and deliver value for the consumer, but sometimes that can be confusing in its own right. So where does supply chain management fit within a competitive framework? And I see there's 4 areas of how we create competitive advantage. The first one is loyalty. How do, if we're driving for loyalty, if that's our, way that we win in the market, that's one thing. There's the other version of that, which is a lowest cost operator, and say Walmart is an expert in really driving it cost right down and handing those discounts and benefits to the consumer to generate more volume, to generate better discounts, and it's at one level a virtuous circle. The other one is where there's a differentiated appeal, so you're a niche player, so that you maybe something like Canada Goose or somewhere in quite a rarefied area where you haven't many direct competitors, and it is the customer centricity or customer centric model of where the delivery is an integral part of the brand. It's starting to percolate up in certainly commentary around here. I don't see too much academic discussion about these as being competitive or forms of competitive advantage, but I think it's going to emerge over the next year or two. People talk about experience, but I think they sometimes trying to describe customer centricity. So given those 4 sort of constraints, what does a supply chain need to do differently to actually succeed? Well, the major thing is getting stuff on shelves. And that sounds very glib in some ways, but it's having a very high availability, especially if you're going for loyalty. You want your customer to come in and grab their favorite brand of toothpaste whenever they feel like coming in. It's always got to be there. So you've got to have a very high in-stock position, and depending on which part of retail you might be in, you could be already at 99, 99.5, but you should be driving towards 100% for your core lines. But also to manage the inventory in such a way you haven't got a whole bundle of inventory, which is very expensive to hold. So you're looking to optimize on-shelf availability as well as having a relatively low level of inventory to support that. So I think those 2 are the key priorities. And then of course, alongside that, there's a number of other periphery areas of importance, which is making sure the store gets it on time. So it gets it on time and in full, which leads towards that goal of 100% in-stock position. So it begs a question for many people who might be already kind of borderline in the supply chain or in the supply chain. It might be very obvious to you why retailers are paying attention to this area, but I don't know if anybody wants to chip in and say, maybe you're not being directly involved in, this description of a supply chain and what's happened over the last year-ish that might lead retailers to really pay attention to supply chain. I'll just say one more thing. The trouble that people in supply chain come to a realization is if it works well, it's very quiet. You only get attention when it falls apart. So I don't know if anybody wants to sort of chip in and, perhaps share their views about, maybe where they are or previous company, how they see how the supply chain is becoming much more important and much more on the C-suite's agenda for investment, for improving, for becoming more robust.
I think, Gary, for us, supply chain has become a huge focus because of what's happened to the Canadian food supply chain during COVID-19. We grew used to supplier fill rates that were 95% and better for years, and then all of a sudden we're seeing supplier fill rates that were sub 30%. So the challenge and the effects on the whole organization to keep the shelves full was massive, and all of a sudden the importance on supply chain and being flexible within your supply chain in order to get product to your stores became a huge focus. So.
Yeah, I quite a few stories of very long hours, lots of really heated activity, trying to fix, resolve supply shortages, working with competitors, go into the food companies and say, look, we have to rationalize our SKU base, but we want something on our shelves. And between Walmart, Costco, Loblaws, etc., had to actually work as a working concept to say to places like Nestle, Conagra Craft, and say, look, we want a 6 or whatever the number might be of your production, and we're prepared to offload our private labels in the short term or our national brands, whatever it may have been, to try and get something in front of our customers. And so that I argued that may have been the glimmer of real collaboration at an industrial level. But I think that shortly after the initial challenges, I think that people went back into their camps, and that was potentially a bit of a lost opportunity to move the whole industry forward. Okay, so the key components for great supply chain management performance. I'm not going to spend too much time in the detail, but I'll just go through each one of these headings. I think these are the 5 key components. Your procedures, your processes, which can go from pretty informal, where if you're in the warehouse, you kind of let Bill put the pallet where he wants to, and then when it comes to be retrieved for either replenishment or a full pallet pick, Bill, where did you put it? Oh, it's just over there. Didn't I tell you? No, you didn't. Or right through to very formal, which is like detailed standard operating procedures. And in an average warehouse, you might see, if it's been done properly, somewhere between maybe 100 and 200, maybe focusing around about 150 standard operating procedures, which document every single operation within the environment. So for instance, if you were, how to pick, well, the first thing you do, if you look at a well-structured SOP, have you got your PPE? Have you got your license to drive the truck? Have you found your counterbalance truck, whatever it might be? Have you picked up your, say, handheld terminal? Have you been trained in this? Right, okay, now go to the location, dial up your work instruction, go straight to location and start picking. And this is exactly how you pick. And the more organized and formal you are, the more predictable the output is. When you leave things kind of unsaid, or I won't work at that level of detail, because they know that's when things can slip through the grid as such. Systems tend to be very, I wouldn't say very diverse, very profuse in terms of the supply chain. So within the warehouse and transport environment, you'll have a warehouse management system, you'll have a transport management system, they have an inventory control system, they have a distributor order management system, and these will in some way plug into an underlying enterprise resource planning or ERP system, which might be SAP or Oracle or whatever. And if you're looking at the warehouse, you may have at least 2 warehouse management types of systems. There may be a warehouse management system which keeps locational control, may drive put away operation by directed put away, and certainly will direct the picking as to be running algorithms in the background to say you must pick from this location, and replan will be driven off of the pick speed. But there's a warehouse control system, WCS, where if a warehouse has an element of automation, so it could be a mini load, a carousel, or just most of the environment might be automated, a very narrow aisle kind of environment that may be automated with cranes and stuff. It needs to be controlled by a WCS, which interfaces with the WMS, then that in turn will interface with the ERP. More recently, somebody's tried to do a bit of a rebrand, and they called it a WES, which is a warehouse executional system, which really is a warehouse management system, but as I say, somebody's rebranded it. And then within transport, you've got within the transport management system, you'll have a whole range of different things attached to that, such as the actual routing, load planning, transport yard management, tracking, you can keep going to, you've completely systemized the whole environment. Then you've got the architecture, which is the actual design of the buildings that you're in. So if you're designing a warehouse, typically if it's over, say, 20,000 square feet, you'll start to see the impact of stanchions in the workspace. So the idea is that you design your warehouse to kind of encapsulate those so they're not in the way, so that you don't have collisions with fast moving counterbalance trucks into things like stanchions, the things that hold the roof up. When you have organization and culture, and more often than not, we can have the best processes, sometimes the best people, systems, architecture, and I'll come on to KPIs in a minute. But if we haven't got a culture that makes us all work to the same goal, then we will have less than perfect performance. And it's often an area which organizations don't look at clearly, because sometimes we can't really define what culture is. I mean, we can describe it in the sense of it's what we do around here. I think that's too broad. And we can even describe it as a set of assumptions and expectations of behavior. Again, that's very broad. But when we're talking about this customer's order, it's met a certain criteria. How do we handle that? That's when we start to see if we've really understood what culture means, especially if we're running in a customer-centric world. When I've gone in to do business turnarounds, that's one of the things I go and attack pretty fast. And I attack it by changing the other things and then demonstrating what good looks like by my own leadership style. So you can change culture pretty fast, but I often have found that you need a burning platform to do it from. When everyone's exhausted their enthusiasm to try and solve problems, and they've called me in to come and help, I know that the culture may be a big part of this in terms of what things remain undiscussable. And then we've got key performance indicators. And again, so many times I've seen warehouse, transport, inventory management, things in the office, purchase order raising, scheduling. We've got KPIs for everything. The thing about KPIs is, because some things are easy to measure, we have a KPI for them. But the very things that are very more difficult to conceive how to measure, we might choose not to have a KPI for that. And then you sometimes get our business intelligence folk sort of taking your KPIs and then doing something kind of weird with them. And you look at the answer, you go, I honestly don't know what that means. I don't know how it needs to influence my behavior, or how to influence the KPI to give me the right result to say, have I been successful in changing my behavior? So what are the key advantages when these factors within an activity area, such as warehouse, transport, or category management, when they're seen holistically, is there an advantage compared to seeing these as when they're in departments, like in the picking department, in the receiving department, in the warehouse? I don't know if anybody wants to kind of chip in with any of their like homegrown KPIs, which are built up over time, or somewhere perhaps where they've worked before, where KPIs trip us up, like they lead us to reinforce our silos.
Hey Gary, it's Mark. I found in the past some of the things that we've looked at, we've experienced that silo effect, that we've looked at sort of the wrong KPIs when we were looking. That if you don't have the right KPI in place, it can cause a false positive, so to speak. And looking at it specific to one category or one item versus a whole. Have you found any of that in the past?
Well, I'll give you a great statistic. I heard yesterday. I went to a vaccine distribution session with CITT, which is Canadian Institute of Transport and Traffic, and they had PwC there, and they were talking about all their plans, their global plans. And here's where a KPI looks stupid. In Canada, we've got a restriction because we haven't got our own homegrown pharma manufacturing capacity, so we're in the hands of Pfizer, etc. So here's a statistic. Please forgive me if I don't get this quite right. The very expensive consultant from PwC said, we've developed this KPI and it's really good. It shows that the vaccines we've had in Canada, which is something like 400,000, something like that, we look at the vaccination rate and we've done 300,000. So we're 75%. We've used 75% of our vaccinations, and obviously we've got a rollout plan to get the rest 25% done, which is so much better than what they've done south of the border. And I said, what's that ratio? And they said something like, I know, they're rubbish, 50%. I said, how many vaccinations have they done? 15 million. That's where the KPI is like nonsense, because they've vaccinated 15 million people. That's like half the population of Canada. So it's a KPI for KPI's sake, because it's one of those input output measures of some form of productivity. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't change behaviors.
Yeah, that's exactly what we found as well, that we were missing a component of that KPI. When you started to look into it a little bit deeper, the context wasn't there.
The idea of a KPI, it helps reinforce the types of behaviors which are typically driven from a vision converted into strategy. And as we execute, we have KPIs that help us to make sure we're still on track for where we need to be. Yes, right, proceed. And they should be positively reinforcing, not saying, oh, you got that wrong, that was terrible.
So we talked a little bit about that in yesterday's session, that anytime we're looking at KPIs or analysis, it should be generating an action item.
Yeah.
And it has to be in context to what it is that you're looking at. Some sort of measurement that makes sense.
Yeah, and I say again that some things are easy to measure, therefore as a KPI for them, versus the things that you really need to measure, more difficult. And sometimes you have to work hard to actually get the KPI, but it's meaningful.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So I'm going to skate over this one. It's called, you may hear in discussions how our supply chain design is wrong, or words to that effect, or it needs to be improved. But just broadly talking about retail supply chain design, there's broadly about 5 categories that have arisen or are still in theory, because as I work down this list, it'd be hopefully quite clear to everybody where their own organisation may be, or organisations they've worked for in the past. So cost optimization, I mean, of course, it sounds incredibly on the ticket, the right thing to do. We're managing our cost in our supply chain. So we're optimizing the cost. We're doing all the logistics trade-offs and making sure we're, getting the lowest possible cost to add the maximum possible value to the end of the supply chain, which is the consumer. But what has happened over a long period of time, because we suddenly found that we could get some of that, in some of our categories, get it done cheaper offshore, and typically in the Far East, in China, in those countries around there. Our view of the supply chain, bear in mind that it can be very silo driven, is that we buy product as cheap as we can, we get it across as cheap as we can, we bring it from the dock to the warehouse as cheap as we can, we get it in the warehouse, we put the operators under a cost per case thing, we get on a truck, the cheapest truck possible, cheapest driver possible, get it to the customer, get it to the store, get it to the customer, whichever destination it's going to. And when we look at each individual element, we may actually be doing a good job. But when we look across the supply chain, we may actually be very suboptimal. And I think that's a vagary of how we see the supply chain. We don't see it as a horizontal process where we're looking for the overall optimization of the supply chain. We tend to look at in silos, in departments. We have budgets organized in silos. So that, say if I'm a warehouse manager, to make me look good on my KPI or to make my case cost per case lower, I may just pick like fury. I don't care what order I put it on the pallet. I just bang it on the pallet, put it in the truck and send it. But when it gets to the store, instead of having it in a semi-store friendly order, it's a bit of a cobble together, and I have to break the whole pallet down. And then once I've broken it down, I haven't got much space to reorganize it. But I have to, if only it was organized, I would be able to, it would save so much time at the store end. But if you say it to a guy in the warehouse, I want my pallets presented in a store friendly manner, they would say, no, it doesn't work like that. I optimize my pick snake, so I go to the fastest first, and then hopefully I'll finish my pick before I go into the sort of areas where I don't really want to visit very much. So we've got real conflicts all over the place. But in each department, we may say, against the budget, we're doing very well. The other one is lean principle, where somebody might have had a view that the supply chain is horizontalized, and we apply, let's call it loosely, lean principles, such as just-in-time, single piece processing, 5S's, always the real lean techniques. But I don't see too much of that being applied actually in retail. I see it quite a lot in manufacturing, but not necessarily much in retail. But we use a term lean interchangeably. It's sometimes called lean principled or lean. We've leaned down our supply chain. But in fact, what I've done is just taken out layers of extra costs and hope that while the volumes have been relatively stable for a fairly long period of time until March, we could describe that as, let's call it like lean principled. Then we have, you'll probably hear, think we need to make our supply chain more resilient. Our supply chain is resilient. In technical terms, resiliency is looking at two components. One is X, which is the period of disruption, maybe measured in weeks, and Y being the period of, effectively, let's call it stock cover. How long could we carry on without disruption to our supply? So if X is smaller than Y, technically we're resilient. But if X is bigger than Y, then we're not resilient. And it's just as simple as that at one very high level. That mathematical formula saying that the rate of sale during the period of disruption is as constant as it was without the period of disruption starts to fall apart. So what does a resilient supply chain look like? I don't think people can describe it very clearly because it's a thought, it's a wish, it's an aspiration. And that takes us into an agile supply chain organization. We sometimes get the two words in the same sentence. Our supply chain is agile and it's resilient. I have to ask the question, what actually do you mean? What are you doing differently now than you were, say, 9-10 months ago? And the descriptions are let's call it vague. So an agile supply chain relies on an agile mindset, which is an organizational, cultural mindset. And then you can run your supply chain in an agile manner, which is flexible. Sometimes we can get flexibility by stretching ourselves as operators, as people in the business. We work a bit longer, we perhaps stop doing some admin, which we used to think was important, but now we use that time to spend more time on pushing things through, expediting things. But that's a different concept to being agile. Agile is about being able to be flexible pretty quickly and calmly. It's like the athlete he or she is going to do a 100-meter sprint. And before that, they're calm, they do the sprint. And after they calm down and cool down, they're calm again. What I see across many retailers is like, it's just flat out. And there's no obvious end to this, except when we get to the real new normal and it might settle down there. And the fifth concept, and it's not being applied pretty much anywhere, and I'm not just talking about retail, I'm not in Canada, I'm talking about globally, is a concept called optionality, where you use a tool called scenario planning, and you look at various scenarios about what happens if, what happens there. And the basis of this is that businesses like to plan 5-year cycles. Imagine that you're in July 2019, you're planning out 2020, 2021, and you start to think, oh, we need a new warehouse, it needs to be 1 million square foot, it needs to be in Toronto area, blah, blah, blah. And this happens to us. And you've dug ground, you've contracted with the thing, you've started to dig ground, and you're now committed to this huge capital investment when you've actually find it really hard to get stock through your network and show you keep people or show you not keep people. Optionality recognizes that we can't predict the future. What we can do is use scenario planning to work out, if this happened, what would we need to do? Okay, can we equip ourselves with half of that solution? Say, for instance, if I was designing a warehouse and this scenario said, well, actually the business might grow by 10% per year or something like that. Well, right now I need 500,000 square foot of warehousing space fully racked. But if it does actually go by 10%, maybe 15%, I actually need 600 square foot warehouse, and I might even buy the racking, but I won't put it up. I'll leave the expensive energy of putting that up until I actually need it. And if you follow that concept through the whole supply chain, you'll see that the way of delivering optionality is having latent capacity around you that you can put into position very quickly without all the hassle of, well, where do I get the racking from? How does it integrate? Do I need a new warehouse management system? All those kind of things. Now, a good video, if you choose to explore that, if you go and find Jim Tompkins on YouTube and find his anti-brittle supply chains, he describes it in a lot more detail, a lot more clearly, I guess, than I do. So just my final question on this, what options should retailers develop for uncertainty? Because we're facing a huge amount of uncertainty. We think that the worst is behind us, but I suspect the worst is still in front of us for the next 12, 18 months. Which design strategy have retailers been adhering to? And I hope that I made it pretty clear. It's the cost optimization. And it's, in some ways, it's quite sensible, because when you've got fairly predictable demand, you've got to focus on the cost to squeeze extra margin out of the supply chain. Does anybody want to chip in here?
Gary, I just want to make sure I understand. So the concept is having the agility. Is it at the back room of the store, or is it at the warehouse that you would have those different options to react to market changes in demand?
Agility is about more flexibility, about being able to focus in and make a change and then move back to steady state. If you can see my hand, it's like you're operating at this level and then you kind of jump up, and it's that ability to jump up, to learn new stuff and to unlearn the stuff that may have prevented you from making a jump. But the whole organization has to have
that's fine.
I did a podcast some time ago, about a month ago, about agile supply chains with a podcaster, and I think he was his expectation was I was going to talk in detail about how to get the warehouse, how to do the transport, etc. And I said, well, you can try and do that, but you're getting into kind of firefighting things when actually you need to look at the organization, its culture. Is it agile minded?
Right.
It needs to have that to allow this to happen. You can't do the supply chain in isolation. You're agile, but my merchandising department is trapped in the past.
So if you've had that contingency racking as an example.
Under optionality.
Optionality, yeah.
Yep.
So you've got your contingency to store product if needed, if the demand rises.
Yeah.
So that would essentially allow operations to fulfill, I guess, the sales potential that way, rather than having that breakdown and having out of stock positions. Is that right? Am I understanding that correctly?
If I've understood you, it's to be able to switch in capacity for one of the 4 or 5 scenarios you envisage the world to look like in the next 2 or 3 years. If you listen to that YouTube video, you'll say that basically the supply chain guys are asked for a 5-year plan, and of course this was all before the pandemic. And they scratch their head. Nobody in business can give them a commitment to what that volume looks like, because you give them the volume, they're working out. It's pretty easy, not easy, but it's in their capabilities. Nobody can do that, so they bring in a consultant to do it for them, and the consultant's faced with exactly the same problems, because most of the thinking has been around optimization, not optionality. And the two are almost incompatible.
Gotcha. Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Okay.
Right.
So I just draw up here let's call it a traditional store replenishment supply chain, where
I wouldn't share any of that.
the category manager is organising, orchestrating what's required based on store orders and forward demand patterns and all the things that Mark and Mark have been talking you through. Purchase orders are issued to suppliers. The suppliers are encouraged to set up receiving appointments. It's all scheduled. So if everything works fine, it comes into the DC on the right, on time in terms of the windows that are allocated to it, gets unloaded, and then it's in terms of receiving. That's the start of a receiving procedure. The QA is done. Have we got enough of the product? Is there any obvious damage? As we maybe sample a few of the cases, does it look all intact? And then we can put it away or put it into a rack. I call it the ProbRes rack, problem resolution, where we talk to somebody in purchasing or the category manager, say, there's a problem here. Can you help us with the supplier and tell us what to do whether or not to receive it with damage or in quarantine, or it's going to be picked up by the supplier. The next thing that sequentially happens is the store orders come in. The first thing they do is go to transport to be routed, because every time the store orders, they're never ordering exactly the same cube and mix and line thickness. So we need to make sure that our vehicles have got the capacity to take the 3 or 4 stores that we're expecting to route, or do we have to take one store off and put it on a different route, or do we just need to run basically the same route with a bigger vehicle, or do we need to break the load into 2 loads? So we're going through all that decision. So they're looking at the equipment they've got, the driver availability, the skill set of those drivers, the store restrictions. It'd be great if I could put it on a 53 footer, but the location can't take it. It can only take a 40 footer or 44 footer. So there's a lot of things to work through, which often the routing system can help with. In terms, it's all about the setup, about what vehicles can be available for this store. The routing, let's call it routing, gets sent back to the warehouse to then organise the pick. So they're, depending if they're in a single temperature location or multi-temperature location, like most groceries are, where you have freezer, cooler and dry, their zonal pick, bring those orders out, assemble them into I missed the step out. If it's a freezer, it's probably left in the freezer until the last minute, but they get brought out into a marshalling area. When those stores are being put together, there's an instruction to load. The instructions carried out with loaders. Once that load is confirmed, the doors are shut and the truck's on its way, ideally on time, because that means that it stands a chance of arriving at the store on time. Now, you also get direct store deliveries, where I would call it the economic footprint isn't. The warehouse doesn't want to see things like pallets of rock salt for winter. It's better that they go straight to the store, because I often see them on the apron of stores. They don't even get really taken into the back. They just drop them out the front and tell me how many pallets. 4 pallets, great, good. Sign your paperwork and you're on the way. When our truck or our third-party truck arrives at the back door, there's receiving, there's quantity check, depending if it's a third party. Perhaps if it's a third party, there's a little bit more attention to this, just in case there's been a wobble along the way. And then the backroom operations separate into singles at that point, or taking them to the shelf end and indicating them to put in the display on the shelves. A pallet drop, how many times have you gone into Canadian Tire, like I have, and seen just pallets dropped in the middle of the floor, this week's promotion? They just bring the pallet out and leave it in the floor. Or vendor display casing, where you work with the supplier to bring in special cases, and it goes through the distribution network on the back of a truck to the store, and it just gets put on, say, an end cap. So the challenges for store fulfillment, as I alluded to, is that there's this constant alignment of individual logistics elements, because each store will never order exactly the same. So, this Wednesday's delivery may look quite different to last Wednesday delivery. It could be a different mix. It could be a different cube. It could be a different line thickness. So line thickness is, say if I had 100 cases to pick, if I pick that 100 cases from 100 locations, that's a very different pick to picking 50 in this slot, 20 in this slot, 30 in that slot. So it's only 3 visits versus 100 visits, because there's a lot of what we call walk to pick distances. And that just is not very value adding within the warehouse. And then on top of that, with all the different cubing, will it fit on the truck we would normally use, or do we have to do something with it, find another trailer, find a different load, split the stores into a different routing sequence, which offers, then you need to tell the stores that it's coming at a slightly different time. And have you got the drivers with the right skill levels to make sure that the delivery is done? Then on top of that, besides that almost conceptual version of the logistics operation, you've got the actual availability of staff. So do they turn up? And particularly at this time of, in our cycle, have they got COVID? Are they having to self-isolate? So it's not like they just don't turn up for one day. They actually won't be turning up for 14 days. So have I got the right skills? And often there's methods of, skill matrices, making sure that, they're ready to go. So they've been properly trained to, they've got an AZ driving license, or, they're a skilled picker and they can drive a forklift truck, a reach truck, or V&A truck. And what is that training plan? Making sure that time is spent on training so that when things go slightly sideways, you can switch people into different areas of the business. One of the big challenges for the supply chain is having real-time locational inventory accuracy. If we have that, we're likely to be successful. If we don't have that, then we're going to struggle because we're going to have out of stocks, we're going to mispick, and when we get to a situation where we're not very accurate on our inventory, it means that there's probably likely to be either a procedural thing that needs to be reinforced, more training to make sure people pay attention to exactly how we want things to be done around here, and or a cultural influence that really nobody cares. I just go pick what I want, throw it onto a pallet, scan a few things, scan it in a slot, but don't actually take it out of the slot and put it on a pallet. Just get it to the end, get it on a truck, and jobs are good. So locational inventory accuracy is indicative, or lack of it is indicative of some things that need to be done. There's capacity constraints. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys have had issues with getting stuff into the warehouse because somebody's saying it's full. When I go into the warehouse, I see empty slots, and of course you will, because if you're running a conventional warehouse with pallet racking, you will find 10% of the locations pretty much empty, and somebody will say it's full. And you say, how on earth can that be full? You can still ram some more stuff in. And what empirically we find that 90% of location occupation is full, because you need stuff to go out before you can bring stuff in, unless you want to put it on the ground and just leave it there, which is very problematical from a locational point of view. So you have capacity constraints in the physicality of the building and the racking capacity. Then you have inbound capacity. You often have door constraints. So you might run out of doors, you may run out of inbound people, supervisors, whatever it might be on that side. Often the critical thing really in some ways is the selection, and if you haven't got a full team arriving for the shift to do all the picking that's been planned, you're running around trying to phone up agencies to bring some people in. Then you go through the routine. Have they been trained? Can they do this? How you train them on our ways of doing things? And by the time the shift's done, they're just about getting up to speed. So that's very expensive in terms of management time, and it's not very productive if you haven't got people that the agency has trained to come in at short notice to help you. And dispatching is, if you have a loader off, all of a sudden the loaders are under a lot of pressure. They're missing their own schedule for getting stuff on trucks, things are running late, and the next thing is people at the store say, where's my stuff? And most importantly, when we think about the supply chain and our discussions with our colleagues in merchandising, marketing, in stores, wherever, we really need to have one version of the truth. We're all aiming towards the same set of KPIs, but really one version of the truth is really important to achieve, because when we're in department, we tend to generate our own kind of spreadsheets which prove a certain narrative, a certain direction or perspective on things, and that may be quite different to the experience of a supply chain in other areas of the business. So as we think about the sheer volume of pallets flowing between the supply network, the supply ecosystem, and our stores, which is typically through our distribution network and our warehousing and transport networks, is it a wonder when we're operating at large scale that mistakes can be made? They can be made, but we can tighten up a whole range of things to make sure they don't get made. But we have to respect capacity. So if the warehouse manager, under a little bit of pressure, says we're full, we have to recognize that. And then we have to work with the warehouse team to say, okay, so you're saying you're full. We now have to prioritize our inbound, because there are some critical things that we need to go out to stores tomorrow, today, and those need to come in. So what can we do to juggle the appointments to bring the important stuff in? In terms of e-commerce, I've got a few models here. One thing I forgot to mention on there is extended aisles. I don't know if many of you operate an environment of extended aisles or warehouse lines. So in the store, you'll maybe have 10,000 SKUs. And it's particularly if you're in shoes or apparel, you'll have certain sizes that prefer to be in the store, and the other sides are in the warehouse. And so when you have a warehouse line event, probably typically need to be done in singles, and those singles will be picked, packed, and then transported by whichever method into the store to satisfy that customer need, maybe the next day. So the conversation with the customer will be, oh, so you want a size 13 shoe of this style? We haven't actually got it here, but we've got it in the warehouse. I'll get somebody to run it overnight. Would you come back and then you can test it? I'm not a great believer in extended aisles, but I understand some of the needs in certain businesses to do those. So as we turn our attention to e-commerce digital fulfillment, we've got a number of models. You're familiar with most of them, but we have marketplaces. If we're, say, Walmart or Amazon, Amazon's a great example of, something like 40 to 50% of Amazon's product are Amazon's product, but the rest of it is marketplace. So basically, in essence, an order is received by the retailer and then handed over to the supplier. There's probably some kind of commission entry into here. And then the supplier ships it directly either to the store for click and collect or BOPIS, or straight to the residential address of the where the order came from. For a DC-based e-commerce solution, we often find that that's where retailers start in terms of their own e-commerce operation. When they think of it as, well, this is going to be small, it's going to be up to 1%. So we're just set up in our own warehouse. And then when it comes in, we probably might offer it just home deliveries. But as soon as we go into singles, we probably need a reconfiguration of our warehouse management system, because there's a couple of things going on here. The normal warehouse management system within a store replenishment cycle is typically dealing with cases only. Sometimes there are some things like ratio packs and some kitting things, but singles aren't really part of the landscape. And again, they are, but typically they're not. So all of a sudden, the warehouse management system, one has to handle things in both cases and eaches, and also the replenishment of pick faces for singles, because you wouldn't want to put cases and singles in the same slot, because it would be a right mess in no time flat. There has to be another link that encourages replenishment to the pick faces for the singles. But because you're starting it off from scratch, you're likely to have everything at pedestrian level. So you can have a manual pick operation. So you can have people who can probably stretch up to 6 foot, maybe 6.5 feet up in the air to actually pick the single, put it in the box and go complete the next part of that order. But if you've got 10,000 SKUs and you're offering those online, you can get into a serious lot of space in the warehouse, much more than you might see in the main bulk of the operation. But again, the DC has to allocate time to put things into singles to support the e-commerce operation. They pick the orders, and it may go to the store for click and collect, or it might go straight to the home. So there might be a small package carrier comes and picks up the stuff every 4 o'clock. Then you have an e-fulfillment network, and I see less of these as time goes on, but somewhere along the maturity path, they said, well, we can't do it in our warehouse anymore. It's just taking too much time. It's very distracting. Let the e-commerce folk and their digital marketing colleagues just set up their own business in business and allow them to run their own e-fulfillment network. And that might be lots of small warehouses, which may be operated by third parties or their own staff. Again, they pick the orders and put the store, it either goes to the store or direct to consumer. So the big issue around those kind of models is if you've got like one big warehouse and it's in Toronto and you're trying to service like Halifax, Vancouver, Winnipeg, wherever, you've got days. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, days were okay. So 5 days to get it to Vancouver and get it to somebody's doorstep might seem okay. But with Amazon saying, well, anything you pretty much like on Prime can come next day, sometime same day if you time your order right. That no longer is a viable model. So stores are starting to think about, well, how do we try and get the stock that we've already displaced into the territory at store level? How can we get this last mile to either to support click and collect, our online service click and collect, or to the home? So they can pick from shelves, which can create a whole range of different issues like space, because you have this timing issue between, okay, I'm picking this order and I normally pick it in earliest order first because I haven't necessarily built the technology to say I'll pick it literally on demand. But we have to put the shop in effectively somewhere for click and collect, or we can ship it to their home. The maturity curve of this is having backroom, what I call backroom sortation, which is to actually have either a manual operation in the back, but typically some new technology in the back, which is called a micro fulfillment center. For clarity, there's like different brands of this. The MFC is like the one that everybody talks about, but I'm seeing more and more nano fulfillment centers. It's really broadly the same thing. It's just that somebody's trying to rebadge it like Dyson and Hoover. But the idea there is the stock comes into the back room, it gets split into singles, put into blue totes, goes into the system, the truck goes away, doesn't come back for another week. But the advantage to this, I can feed that stock to stores every day, every 2 days, as well as support click and collect and home delivery from that warehouse, and it doesn't have to go into the store. And typically it's automated, although micro fulfillment can be done on a manual basis. But typically when people talk about micro fulfillment, they're talking about an automated system. And then you advance that to dark store, which may actually be a store which has been evacuated and converted into effectively a larger micro fulfillment center, or it could be a purpose-built building, warehouse, small warehouse around the corner, and it supports a small number of stores, maybe 3 or 4 local stores. And again, it supports click and collect from that location as well as click and collect from the stores, being picked in that environment and being shipped to the stores, or home delivery straight from that dark store, so it doesn't affect the store operation at all. And it can also be used to replenish store shelves. So the challenges with digital fulfillment, and this is a huge elephant in the room, that people have got onto the bandwagon that somehow e-commerce is going to save retail and it's going to make so much money, and it's a fast growing bit. It's grown at like 30-40%, and this pandemic has given us a golden opportunity to flog a lot of product to customers. But often the financial models that have been built to say, yes, this is a good idea, let's go forward with it, they can be fraught with errors. They can be on a basis that they may not have done e-commerce before. There'd be a number of costs that suddenly come into their appreciation after they launch into it. So they may think, right, on the basis of this and this volume that we hope to achieve, yeah, we're going to go forward with e-commerce. We're going to offer our proposition online. And then, and we had a great example of this time last year for Target, who were growing a great rate of knots in terms of e-commerce and their shipped operation. But in this quarter, they said our e-commerce sales have grown 141%, but we didn't quite make the money we thought we would do. Of course, next quarter they'd worked out what had gone wrong. They corrected that, so they just carried on piling on the e-commerce sales, and it's been relatively profitable for them. The other thing around e-commerce is the customer acquisition costs. From a supply chain point of view, it really doesn't matter, but from a business point of view, the customer acquisition costs, the ad spending, getting clicks on Instagram, thinking about live streaming events, and having shoppable versions on TikTok and stuff like that. This is a huge cost, which again doesn't necessarily appear in the financial model at inset. So if you look at Wayfair, they spend $250 million worth of ad spending to try to bring you onto their site every quarter. And if you think about the majority of reasons why people might go to Wayfair for the first time, they might be interested in buying some furniture. Then you have to argue, we spent this money to get you here, you better buy more than just one piece of furniture, because the chance of you coming back and replacing that furniture may be many, many years hence. So it's a real big kind of cost suck, the customer acquisition costs. Just as there's not such a thing as a free lunch, nor is there such a thing as free digital fulfillment or free logistics, free delivery. And on top of that, it's a real double whammy, because depending on which category you're in, If you're saying apparel, you probably might get a 8 to 10% return rate from a store purchase, but that figure probably doubles, triples, or even quadruples when it's e-commerce. Some of these things retailers do to themselves. They give a glossy picture, and when the garment's actually received through e-commerce, they go, "Oh, this isn't it." Or they may say, if you hit a certain monetary target, we give you free shipping, because they think that maybe all that will stick and there's just about enough money to get it to the customer's home. And sometimes people buy lots of different sizes and shades because they're not quite sure. It's not like going to the store and going up to the garment and going, "Oh, that's never going to suit me, but this one might, and let me try it on. Yep, fine, I'm good with it. I'll go and buy it, and it shouldn't really bounce back unless there's a defect." Assortment planning can go overboard on e-commerce. We can go from, say, if we have 10,000 SKUs in our store, some bright spark maybe from merchandising, well, you know what, let's double it online. That sounds like a good idea, until you realize that the original assortment online wouldn't make money, so you're adding more assortment online, and it's likely to make less money, and then you try and accelerate the growth of that part of that business, and so you accelerate your losses. How does e-commerce fit within the overall proposition? And I think that during this time, more companies are going to be questioning how do we make this fit? And there's an unfortunate word called phygital. How do we combine digital and offline together so they're a coordinated proposition? And what are the long-term implications if for doing that or not doing that? So I'm going to skip over the next question, except to say, just to raise that with all this technology that's available to retailers, guess what? It's also available to CPGs. So those CPGs were always wanted to embrace the relationship with their consumer, or their customers and consumers. They can avail themselves of MFCs and that kind of technology. They can run a dark store, and importantly, they've never had as cheap route to market in terms of property as will develop over the next, say, 12 to 18 months as retailers, small retailers particularly, fall by the wayside. They free up property. Suddenly the likes of Kraft and Conagra, etc., start saying, it's now possible. We never thought we could do it because we're used to our manufacturing capacity, and our design of our supply chain is all about producing pallets worth of single SKUs, shipping off to DCs, job done. But now we can actually construct a truckload and send it into a dark store and service our customers direct and have that relationship. So we as retailers need to have that in the back of our mind. These technology jumps for us as retailers to help us with online also apply to CPGs. So what kind of issues are keeping supply chain managers up at night? Probably alluded to it. So visibility of inbound, outbound loads, how are going to be handled, what's the kind of mix of it, have we got capabilities for this, capacity for this, changes in those demand patterns, both quantity and mix. New products, they're always kind of interesting as they come into warehouse. Can we catch it quickly enough, measure it, so that we can actually put the item master data in at the entry point and let the system tell us what's the best location for it, what's the best tie high, how best to get this into the warehouse, and has a supplier already configured a pallet to work with our thing, or does it mean we have to say, "Oh, the supplier, you need to order it in these quantities so it comes in as a pallet and goes straight into our facility." Promotions, that's always an interesting one in the warehouse and transportation, especially if it's a big bulk one like Coca-Cola or something like that, where you're shifting a lot of cube for relatively lower margins. Control of inventory, integrity, the item data, getting the master data right, and how the rules are, the rules for directed put away, directed picking, are they still relevant to now as our business is changing and morphing, especially again through this period of the pandemic and lockdowns and excessive demands in different SKUs than we ever encountered? Do our rules still work? Do they need to be re-engineered? And then trying to plan. Imagine you're in, I don't know, August 2019, you're planning for 2020. Now you're in August 2020, trying to plan for 2021, what data do you use? How do you plan that? How do you convince your colleagues that these are the volume assumptions and we better go out and get those volumes? And what resource how about if that's wrong? So does anybody want to volunteer and say, operating a supply chain effectively is pretty easy? Because I hope nobody's come away with that impression. But I think that using some guidance, we can actually do a really good job of improving the quality and the predictability of our supply chains. But a question I want to ask you guys is, what is your first question to ask when you hear the supply chain is behind? What goes through your mind? And the supply chain's behind, and it might be described as the warehouse is behind, or the transport behind, or the receiving's behind. What kind of questions might go through your mind?
When are you going to catch up?
Yeah, well, what you're doing to catch up.
Yeah, that too.
I wonder what the issue is.
Yes, and to make sure that you being on the receiving end of a supply chain that's kind of getting behind, what's it mean to you?
Exactly.
They tell you, oh, you just don't understand my world. I've got a few people off on COVID. Yeah, but what are you doing about it? Because I've still got to run promotion. I'm still responsible for delivering the GM on this planogram. So I need you to understand this is important. What are you doing about these things? Is there any obvious questions that anybody wants to go back to? Now we've got to the end of the supply chain bit. Anything I went through, I'm just going to flip through the slides quickly and get to prompt you. No.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about this whole dark store idea, and is this picking up momentum? Like, why are companies choosing this over other approaches? And what do you see happening with the dark store? Is this something that's going to grab hold and grow, or is it just something that people are flirting with and they're really not going to continue with that approach?
I suspect we're in a kind of a suck it and see it stage. I mean, the world has become incredibly uncertain. The dark store concept, it's one of these other concepts that either you can do it in the back of your store, and most stores would need some persuading to give up sales space for this warehouse operation. The dark store may just naturally arise from you're trying to rationalize your store fleet, and also this one's empty, but you've got a long lease on it. What are we going to do with it? Do we want to default on the lease and end up paying a fortune, or can we use it? And then maybe if you're not in that situation, you may find that another retailer that is ideally their store is ideally situated to service 3 or 4 of your stores or 2 stores, actually becomes free. And you think, I'm going to get a good bargain with this. I'm going to go on a short-term lease, maybe a year, 2 years, and I'm going to put in a facility into that and get the truck to turn up there, do all the work there, and just go that 3-way split, one to the store or the 2 stores, or how many stores you've got in that network there, and then feed my click and collect and also home delivery out of that operation without disturbing the natural flow of the store. So there's dark stores. One, there's a concept, and 2, I think Loblaw's recently, when I say recently, it's probably about a year ago, they started to explore micro-fulfillment out of some space they found. I think they found something like 16,000 square feet in downtown Toronto or Etobicoke. They found this space and they put a micro-fulfillment into it, and it effectively, I think we could call that broadly a dark store, because it wasn't a back room, it was just some space. Maybe it was one of their smaller locations. They decided to come out and they said, oh, what we're going to do, we've got this big lease, so we've got to use it in some way. So the dark store just helps to get the stock into the right territory, so you're not having a huge excessive last mile and time delay between, say, Toronto and Vancouver. So you can put the micro-fulfillment facility into it, so the stock is held in the local territory and it doesn't disturb the store in terms of its natural processes. I think dark stores is much more, it's less cerebral, let's put it that way. You just decide we're going to put the MFC, rather than take space from the store, we're going to put it over here. It's an opportunity. We're going to use this dead space and make it work. So I think that my general view would be that will be on the increase.
I've actually used it in the past, Gary. When there was an acquisition, we were in that position of stuck with a lease with one of the national companies, and we actually used it as a centralized piece for Halifax. That's where the shipments came out of.
Yeah.
At first, it was a kind of a scary idea, to be honest, of how logistically does this work. But once we get into it, it was a huge savings. Generally, we had a 3PL provider, so we had to pay for extra warehousing space on top of, what we were already, cost of carrying and things like that. Where this one, it gave a purpose to something that we were already paying for.
Yeah, it's like at one level it's a risk if we've got a long leasehold and got nothing in it. What are we going to do with it? Put some more shelving in it, make it a store? No, we've just come out of it because it's not positioned right. It's not in the right location. It's not got enough passing traffic. Opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to find lots of creativity during this time that retailers look at things in a slightly different, with a slightly different paradigm.
It added quite a bit of profitability to the bottom line, saving those 3PL costs.
Yeah.
So you could run a warehouse or a distribution center and have store fulfillment from one side and customer fulfillment from another portion of that warehouse, could you not? In a dark store format?
Yeah, I think that's what I've described, that you have that three-way split. You can still get the big truck to turn up and do that machination to get it into the system. But as the stores downgrade their stock, you just turn up every day with, this is what you need for your shelves today. Oh, by the way, I've got some click and collect, which I can actually get people to come and do at that location, or take that to the store as part of that store top up, or home delivery directly from that location. So you can actually punch a few doors in there and suddenly it becomes a very purpose-built facility. And
the dark store is definitely a unique perspective and utilizing space you're paying for regardless.
We find opportunity, things that we thought we were saddled with suddenly become opportunities.
Yes.
And especially with the micro-fulfillment technology constantly advancing, improving, and being more reliable.
Yes.
So along those lines, Gary, I apologize you've answered this. I was just thinking, with the introduction of COVID and the buy online, pick up in store, have you seen an increase in those dark locations that you can direct your customer to pick it up directly from the dark location?
I haven't directly, but I'm going to cross my fingers and say that it would be sensible for stores who are rationalizing to actually take traffic away and confusion away from their stores, so we can just focus on what they need to do when we reopen in Ontario, to actually direct them to the dark store, where it probably has some nice, easy to access aprons that they can come in, click and collect, or home deliveries over here, and they can still carry on replenishing the stores from the local stock holding rather than waiting for a truck to turn up.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been very valuable to you and your business. You can connect with me via the web, www.RetailAID.ca, and go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn by typing www.linkedin.com/in/last-mile. Look forward to hearing from you and playing an active part with your supply chain and business's transformation as you start thinking boldly, thinking big, scaling, adapting, and winning.